how have you been? It's been really long since we last had a chat. I think you guys were still called
I
Abacus back then.
know. Yeah, no, it's been, oh man, I was just on an interview and it's just kind of wild, like how long it has really been since we started working on this. But no, it's been a fun ride for sure. How about you?
All good, all good. I think like for the last 3 years, there's been so many changes, but then it's good to see that the people that were here 2 years ago, they're still here. That's always a positive side.
Yes, survived.
Okay, so we can just get started. So like I scheduled this space just to, check in with you guys because I see a lot of announcements, a lot of developments from Hyperlane, and you also recently announced the Hyperlane Foundation. And I, just like wanted to get your thoughts on multiple things that are going on in this space. So maybe if we can just start with a quick intro about you and the project, that'll be good.
Yeah, so my name is Nam. I'm one of the uh, founders of Hyperlane. We started, like you said, 2.5 years ago to basically help build interoperability in our industry. And yeah, like I think our focus has been basically since the last 2 years at least on kind of what we call like the permissionless part of interoperability. A lot of that has been inspired by APC, but the idea is that like, hey, 2 years ago we started the inklings to see of like how much more block space will created, and it was kind of like our opinion that like what was lacking for that kind of like feature to come to fruition is interoperability that like you didn't have to ask for to kind of get all of these chains connected. And so that's basically what we've been working on over the last 2 years. It's been definitely been a grind, but I'm kind of glad that a lot of the things that we saw that 2 years ago has kind of like come true, and obviously we're seeing now a lot of the kind of like benefits of having been early on that kind of trend.
Awesome. So you kind of mentioned like how you guys are building permissionless tech, and I've seen like from the early days you've given a lot of emphasis on this permissionless expansion, and it also shows in like how you've designed the protocol. So maybe you can just give us a sense of like why is this feature so important to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to us because we think I was saying this last week on the other panel, but you know, if I think about like the last, let's say, I don't know, 10, 15 years of crypto, right? Like what made it like really amazing, like what made it the industry that it is today is that it was, right, like all as weirdos, like, right, like thinking like, whoa, this is cool. Like we could do this. And right, like we didn't have to like ask like Stripe, or like we didn't have to ask like kind of government agency for access to this kind of system, right? Like anybody could do this. And to us it just like was always true that yeah, like that is what propels this industry forward. This is what kind of allows this innovation to happen. And like having kind of permissioned, and obviously we can talk a lot about what is actually permissioned, what is not permissioned, but like having permissioned systems as key infrastructure in that industry just felt like very like counterintuitive. And so that's why we have focused so much on kind of like, look, if there is a team like just two guys somewhere in India that want to just start like think like, hey, this is a better way of creating a rollup, but like we need to be connected to, right, like all these other big chains where the liquidity is at. Like we don't want to have any team, including Abacus Works, like the core development company here that we started. We didn't want that to be in the way of that kind of connectivity, and so we focused a lot of our efforts on building kind of what we call this like open source interoperability framework to kind of like make that true, to basically like give back the power of crypto back to the indie developers, so to speak.
I think that perfectly makes sense, right? Like that's why all of us are in crypto in the first place. Like if we needed permissions, then we would all just be using bank accounts still and then not be building in crypto. So I
Exactly.
really like that about the whole project. And I think it's also like just really beautiful how you guys have been building for permissionless from day one, but then with this whole modular expansion, how these two kind of narratives have come together, and there's so much growth now for Hyperlane. Like I see that there have been so many partnerships, so many teams are building permissionlessly on top of you guys. So can you comment on that? Maybe like what has the growth been like over the last 3 months, and what's the morale in the team?
Yeah, I think growth has been great. We like again, I think it's always so weird to be here now, right? Because obviously, like a year or two ago, like, that was a lot less clear. Um, but yeah, I think the really cool thing, I think, the reason why morale I think is high, right, is because like whenever you work on an open source project, right, like, especially in the beginning, and I've worked on other open source projects before, like I think whenever you get that kind of first pull request, or like that first issue where like somebody was kind of asking a question about what you'll be doing, right, like that's kind of like magic. And I think just seeing a lot more of that than I've ever seen before is like just like, yeah, it's super motivating, right? Like the idea that like, wow, there's all these people. Like it started like again like a year and a half ago. Like I remember one of the early teams was like the Kalani folks, right? Like where we didn't even have the tooling yet ready to allow people to like deploy Hyperlane to new chain, but they were so eager that they just kind of like worked through our code base, including our internal tooling, which is also open source, and they were basically able to figure out deploy Hyperlane to their like testnet. So I think it's those kind of experiences which I think kind of like, as long as we're on the trajectory, that more people will do so. And yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that like happen right now, right? Like more and more people realize, look, like there's this open source like interoperability framework that we can use for our purposes, and whether that's like, yeah, like the Starknet community with like the Pragma folks who are building Hyperlane for like Cairo, or like um, the Movement Labs folks who are building it for the Move ecosystem. Like this definitely like, it's very vindicating to see how like this kind of like open source approach like is starting to get traction.
I think it's pretty underrated how like the fact that other teams can just contribute has contributed to so much of the Hyperlane development as well, right? Like today, I think Hyperlane supports the most number of VMs out of any interop protocol, and that's not just because of like your work. It's also because of Movement Labs contributing for like their specific VM implementation, and then Starknet for Cairo, and then I think Mitosis for Cosmosm. And so it's just like really nice to see how other teams are also coming together to, just use the tech because they can.
Yes, no, it is again, it's super cool, right? Like I think like you mentioned the Mitosis team, right? Like it was originally the Mitosis team who, right, like basically saw this framework and were like, look, like again, like not many people have done it yet, but like we think it's easier to get interoperability for kind of the Cosmos chain that we were planning on than to build our own.
Losing
And
you a
then
little
that's
bit
when, right,
in
like they just
in
started
the
working on it. Like,
yeah,
oh,
just
sorry,
like
say again.
your voice is slightly breaking off in the middle, but I think we're good.
Oh, sorry. All right, good, cool. Yeah, I was just saying that, like, like, yeah, the Mitosis team was, right, like able to look at the framework and be like, hey, look, like obviously, like, documentation can always be better, but at least here it's open source. Like we can ask these guys some questions, but like we can do it ourselves instead of like having to build our own interoperability framework. And what's even more fun to see is that like, right, like since the deployment of that kind of Cosmos implementation that Mitosis worked on, there's a bunch of other people in the Cosmos ecosystem who have been like rallying around that implementation, have been able to improve it, have been able to deploy it. Like one of the kind of like key parties there is like the Stride team, who right, like saw this as an opportunity to kind of like improve their product, basically like exporting like, right, like stake tier and other assets to more chains. And so it's actually now the Stride team who's kind of honestly probably one of the best teams to basically like help other Cosmos chains kind of get interoperability with Hyperlane. And like the beauty is that like none of us here at Abacus Works really know that much about Cosmos. And so it's just like a beautiful kind of like example of like how open source can be its best when you allow people to kind of collaborate together. on this kind of like open source framework.
Definitely, that's so cool to hear. So kind of moving on to the elephant in the room, like you guys made a big announcement last week launching the Hyperlane Foundation and also the Hype token. Uh, can you like give us a sense of what the token is all about and like what role can be expected to play? Of course, like feel free to not answer any further questions if that's not allowed. But yeah, just share with us whatever you can.
Yes, so I want to be clear that like me as Nam Chu Hoai, I work at Abacus Works, which is kind of like a company that the foundation contracts to do a lot of development work and other kind of like operational tasks, and ultimately it's up to the foundation to kind of like basically announce or launch, I guess, any of the work that it has mentioned in its blog post and its launch tweet. But from what I can tell you about from the publicly available information, right? Like the idea is that like basically the extension of this kind of like open source like framework, right? Like means that like it's the people, it's the developers, it's all these various stakeholders that make like to create this beautiful story of this kind of like open source network. Like those are the people who the Hyperlink network will want to kind of make sure that they own basically the Hyperlane network and make them have kind of like a stake in kind of the future of that network. And so definitely like stay tuned for more announcements from the foundation. But we just felt that it was important for people to recognize that like this is kind of like a logical next step in this kind of like open source kind of like storyline.
Makes sense. And whose idea was it to like call it hype? Because that's a really good ticker.
I don't know. I certainly can't claim credit for it. I don't know that actually I know who is the originator of this, but I think once whenever the brainstorming happened for it, like it was one of the options on the table, and I think like you said, like it seemed pretty clear. Or like I guess, and nobody can argue that like it's not a great ticker. So don't know who I guess came up with it.
Okay. Okay. So like, I mean, on a personal level though, like, what are your thoughts on the whole airdrop meta? Like, the consensus take on Twitter right now is that it's over. But then, personally, I feel like everyone just is repeating what everyone else is saying, and then after like once they get a good airdrop, everyone's opinion will change again. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I don't know if this is my upbringing or not, but I feel like I try to have a lot less opinions and judgment on like what other people do. I think people do what they want to do, and I don't. I like who am I to say whether that's good or bad? And so I think it feels kind of productive to like label like things as good and bad. I think at the end of the day, like what I think I and hopefully many other people are focusing on is like, hey, can you like build useful things for this world? And like if you do that, it is my personal belief that like the world will kind of like give back to you. And so in that sense, like honestly, like uh, I'm not too tuned in the meta there. Like I personally like missed out on the Celestia job, like so I'm probably the wrong person to ask in terms of like what do I think is the right thing to do here. But I think in general, probably we all could benefit from a little less judgment of like um, people who just again act in this permissionless world. Like um,
Makes sense. So I also have a question from the Jumper intern. Feel free to just say that I cannot answer it. He wanted to know if like there'll be a
I don't know if I just lost information. But can you repeat the question?
Like, so like, will there be a percentage allocation for everyone has staked their TR because they're supposed to get airdrops from ecosystem partners, but then they're all down bad right now. Never mind. If it's just a joke.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, so I think if I understand correctly, the question was like, are like X like is there some allocation for whom and what? And like I guess I cannot answer that question because yeah, like I said, I'm not the foundation. But I'm sure whenever the time is right, the foundation will announce kind of like the actual distribution mechanism.
Kind of moving on from Hyperlane stuff, I also get, just your thoughts as a developer and interop on some of the recent developments in the space. So if you've seen the recent Optimism announcement, like they announced Superchain native interop, and how there'll be native messaging between all of the chains that connect to the superchain. So what are your personal like thoughts on that? Does it reduce the need for something like Hyperlane, or are there like no consequences?
Yeah, no, I think a great question. Native OP native interrupt is definitely something that we have, followed with yeah, a lot of excitement because I think it's going to be the first of I think many uh, attempts from different projects to basically improve interoperability. And like like I think the existence of interoperability projects like Hyperlane and others certainly like does not preclude others from trying to improve interoperability at large. And I think it's definitely very welcomed that we finally get a team like Optimism actually be able to deliver on I think a lot of like maybe more theoretical points that like people have made in the past about like, oh, interoperability will be solved in X or Y. And I think what if I've learned anything about interoperability in the last 2.5 years is that like there's like again like conceptual or like theoretical ways of solving interoperability, and then there is the like real world of like how to do that. And so yeah, just for that, I think like the fact that like the OP team chose to like actually tackle on interoperability, like much respect for them. To the point about like will it reduce the need for other interoperability protocols? Like I don't think so. Like I think again, if I learn anything, it's like building interoperability is pretty hard, and we've been talking with the OP team as well because yeah, again, like I think in this day and age, I don't know that you want to be building a lot of things from scratch. And like one of the things, for example, that we're talking with with the OP team about is like like I think they focus a lot on what we would say probably like we would traditionally call the verification mechanism of like verifying that like a message from like a superchain rollup to another superchain rollup is valid. But there's so many other things in the stack that have to be solved, right? Like, and so one thing that we are focusing a lot on, for example, is like, right, like relaying, like being able to like pay a relayer, like the developer tooling around like local testing and like remote testing, like having like visibility for a developer, like if their like transaction is getting reverted or like not processed, why is that the case? So I think a lot of the tooling again that we've built in our open source framework very much applies to native interop as well. And like so we've been talking to the OP team about basically implementing the native interop scheme as an ISM, and then like as a developer, like you get again all of the things for free, like relayers, like token bridges, on top of native interop.
I guess from like the supporting toolkit, of course, all the interop teams have developed a lot of the infrastructure here, right? So it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel when a lot of the hard work has already been done. So I definitely agree with the fact that they should be talking to you guys, talking to all the other teams, and learning from all the experience that you have. But purely from a like message frequency perspective, if all of these projects have their own native interop solution, I feel like third-party
Mhm.
messaging bridges. I don't know if will you still need to send the same number of messages, or will it just be like reduced to, sending a message from something like a super chain to another chain in Polygon ad layer, for example.
Mhm. I mean, it reminds me a bit of the conversation of like, if we move all the activity over to L2s, won't that reduce the need to have like transactions on L1? And honestly, I don't know the answer either. Like, I think, it's kind of like only one way to find out situations, but it is certainly, well, I guess, first of all, like, I think even, right, like with native interop, there still have to be messages between, let's say, superchain chains, and those still have to be relayed, right? There still has to be like developers building those kind of applications that will send those messages. Like, I think, more like interoperability protocols that have taken a more modular stance with respect to verification are going to be able to still play a pretty big role in even like kind of like intra-system interoperability. And then, like you said, like even right, like across like different ecosystems, like how much of that traffic will be intra versus inter, like it definitely will be exciting to kind of like figure out, right? Like I think a similar kind of like story can be asked about like, oh, like right, like if everything moves to intense, like won't that reduce the need for like messaging as well? I think like again, this is one of those things where like I would say like, hey, I'm just trying to focus on building a useful like kind of like primitive for developers to use. And I think as long as it's useful to developers, I feel pretty good.
Makes sense. I think
Can't tell if that's me or
intense versus messaging. So I think from a message they've built in-house, but I don't think Hyperlane has a similar solution. So is anyone else building something like this on top of you guys?
So I think I might have lost some internet, but if I understand correctly, the question was probably like, hey, like Hyperlane is probably one of the interoperability projects that doesn't have like a liquidity layer like Stargate or Cross. Was that the question?
I'm definitely like losing you in the middle, so not sure.
All right, let's see.
I can hear all of this, so that's
Yeah, that's also weird. Like I feel like I hear you so well, but then sometimes it's just like gone. But okay, let me repeat my question. I guess I think I want to say you asked me like, hey, Hyperlane is one of the few interoperability projects that don't have the liquidity layer like Stargate, and you're probably asking about like, hey, what do you think about that?
yeah. Like I first question would be like, why did you guys not successfully model? Would be, are there any teams that you know that are building this type of solution on top?
Um, okay, I'm really sorry. I think it must be my internet, but I think what you're saying is like, yeah, why did you guys not build it? That was the first question, and yeah, I think the reason was because like I believe a lot in like focusing on what you're good at, and like we generally believe that I think what we're good at is building this kind of like you know developer framework for like messaging first and foremost. Like I think it was hard enough to build this and to get to the spot where we're at, and so I think I cannot imagine like if we had to also feel like, oh man, we need to build this whole additional like protocol. I think that just what I think wouldn't have served anybody well. And it's again, it's similar. Like I really like believe in this kind of model where you just focus on what you're good at. You build like this open source framework, and you allow other people to kind of like build around and on top of it. And so in that sense, yeah, we've definitely have other projects who kind of I think recognize that like, hey, like you're not going to be competing, right? Like with kind of like a first party Stargate on top of Hyperlane. And so there's definitely other kind of like projects who um, kind of like realizing that yeah, some of the like Hyperlane stack could probably use this kind of service area. right? Like I think one of the teams that we've been working together with is Kalani, right? Like they've been working on this kind of collaborative solver network, and so yeah, definitely expect that there will be kind of like more people coming out of the woodwork there. Like another one actually, right? Like it's Everclear, their clearing layer will start with like Hyperlane messaging to basically allow for the netting of these kind of flows for the different solvers that they're working with.
Makes sense. I almost forgot that like almost a year ago or even more than that, Kalani first started like as a liquidity bridge on top of Hyperlane. At least that's how I was introduced to it. So it's pretty crazy to like see where they are today and what's their design now.
Yes, no, for sure. I mean, like I think it speaks volumes to the fact that I think we're still so early in exactly right, like yeah, how these liquidity networks and bridges should look like, and obviously we're seeing a lot of like interest lately in this category, and there's definitely like more work that I hope that like we can be helpful with as well. But yeah, like yeah, definitely fun to see. I think Kevin and team working on Kalani over the last year and a half.
Awesome. So like we'll just wrap it up in a few minutes. If do you have any like closing thoughts, any news related to Hyperlane that people should look out for in the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, I think I would like to let actions speak louder than words, and so I would say, like, you know, stay tuned for kind of like all the work that is happening in the Hyperlane ecosystem. You know, if you are a builder who, right, like, yeah, launching a new chain, like, definitely there's been a higher pace of like Hyperlane deployments, and so it should be uh, as easy as ever to get Hyperlane onto your chain. If you're interested, definitely check out our docs or feel free to reach out to me as well. And then honestly, what you said towards the end, I think this kind of idea of like liquidity networks is definitely very interesting to us, and I kind of recognize that like you know, like still there's nothing beyond the docs that like people can look at and point to and try out is a thing. And so if you're a developer, you know, who sees that similarly and is kind of interested, definitely would like to chat to you, because I think there's a lot of like very like I think right, like since we just mentioned Kalani and Everclear and you know other teams that I've been chatting with over the last couple of weeks as well, like I think there's a lot of like nice kind of like collaborative opportunities here, and that we can, I think, replicate from what the kind of first right like use case of just arbitrary message bridging. I think a lot of us kind of like collaborative opportunity on like working on shared open source frameworks and tooling can definitely be applied, I think, to like yeah solver networks and the intent space more broadly. So if that's something of interest to you, please reach out.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Nam. It was great, like just catching up with you after a long time, and thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Hope to see you around the world one of these days again.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Have a good day. Okay, we'll just close this now.
All right. Have a good day, Arjun. See ya.
Bye. Thank you all.